Hey, what's up, Canada and beyond? Welcome back to another afternoon discussion of Doctor Talks. This has been such an honor and a pleasure. I'll tell you guys to finally get some people speaking to us in common sense and telling us what is going on. From a level of expertise and knowledge that we can trust. They're real people. They're taking the time to sit down and explain things from their expertise as they see them, and this has been a real honor to host all of these guys. At the same time, we're what we're seeing is a community rallying together under the same principles and the same common, reasonable sense approach to things. So today we have a new face for us. Welcome to the show, Dr. Harvey Risch. Thank you for taking the time to join us today and maybe shed a little bit of light on the world as we know it from a place from somebody that understands it a little bit better than we do.
Pleasure to be with you today.
So where are you from, and tell us what is it that is your knowledge and corner of foundation of information that you end up speaking with us today?
Okay, so it's great to address the Canadian audience for me. I'm not Canadian, but I worked at the University of Toronto for 8 years and loved being there. I learned my epidemiology from the great Canadian epidemiologist, Dr. Tony Miller, and that was my formative introduction to field work in epidemiology, and it's probably the best that I could have gotten anywhere in North America. I came to COVID a little bit indirectly. I'm mostly a cancer epidemiologist. I'm interested in how cancer works and what causes it. But in fact, after medical school, I went and did a PhD that was in mathematical modeling of infectious epidemics. And I published on that. And that I did a little work as a postdoctoral fellow and then got into cancer. But early last year, because of my interest and work in epidemics, I was a member of the Connecticut Academy of Science and Engineering, which it had a committee for the reopening of the state of Connecticut. And so I was a member of that committee along with another dozen eminent scientists and working out kind of out of the box and off mainstream thinking about what we could do to help the state reopen safely. And in that work, I got interested in why there was such a controversy about the drug hydroxychloroquine. And what really, I think, bothered me at that point was the disconnect between statements that hydroxychloroquine was unsafe as used in hospitalized patients, and therefore that applied to outpatients, people who had just become sick with COVID, needed some treatment, nothing was offered. This drug was at that time being suggested to be effective for treating COVID early on. And there was evidence from France and from the US and from China and Korea. And so this was an increasing body of knowledge at that time. And yet there was all this strange pushback that just didn't make sense to me. And so I sat down with the literature and investigated all of the studies that had been published up to May of last year to see what I would make of it as a kind of rational scientist doing etiologic kinds of thinking. And I didn't just look at hydroxychloroquine. I also looked at remdesivir, which was also in the making at that time. And I figured out that every study that had been published about hydroxychloroquine, when used early, showed benefit. There weren't a lot. There were, I think, 5 studies at that time, but they were all uniform in showing benefit when it was used in outpatient setting. And so I wrote the paper thinking that this is just obvious science. And, the fact that there is some strange pushback against this with some, irrational belief that was somehow coming into the picture, but not part of the scientific evidence base. Little did I know what I was in for. And kind of the rest has been the continuous history of this whole problem and where we're at now.
This is interesting that this is where you came to this. Um, I think I've got a bit of awkward feedback here. Um, but this is consistently what I'm hearing from different experts and specialists from all points of the continent and different disciplines of research and medicine and science. And they've all seemed to go back to that same point where of their own research and doing this independently with no connection between any of almost a dozen specialists and doctors and scientists that I've interviewed here now. They all seem to kind of run into the same inconsistencies, starting at the same place with the same research and going through the same process. And then they end up, trying to ask questions about this and paying a price for it, without reason or common sense to it. And this is, I think, where most of us in the general public, although we're not educated specifically in those fields, with all of the lockdowns, we've been a very captive audience and very adamant in trying to find our own answers. And we're finding the same consensus, but we're not seeing that from the measures being enacted upon our provinces right now. And so this is how, I guess, what ultimately leads you to sitting here in a chair talking with me is a challenge to a public debate, correct? This
Correct.
is something that you're taking part in.
Yes, that is true. And we've been through a lot. All of us, both of our countries have been through quite a lot already.
And have you received any kind of acknowledgement or positive response to this at this point?
I've actually received a huge amount of positive response. I get hundreds of emails per day. It's been that way. I've got 50,000, close to 50,000 emails in my saved emails from the last year. There are so many people who have been affected by this. What's happened, we can talk about lockdowns and strategies and so on in a few moments, but what's happened is that a number of doctors, feeling the inconsistency of the circumstance and knowing that hydroxychloroquine is a very safe drug and effective in this usage, have, in spite of all of the government agency warnings, gone on to use it either quietly or openly, depending on their state regulations, and have treated patients over this last year. And what we've discovered, since all of us who have been doing that, we're kind of balkanized. We don't know about each other. We've come together over that time to learn about each other. But what we've discovered is that the telemedicine groups that are treating COVID patients in the U.S. one group has treated 70,000 COVID patients as outpatients. Another one has treated 20,000. A doctor in Houston, Texas, has treated 20,000 herself. Another group of doctors in Southern California has treated 5,000. Dr. Zelenko, who was one of the pioneers of this, has treated 3,000 or 4,000 patients. In total, what we know about is more than 120,000 patients who've been treated with hydroxychloroquine safely. A handful of deaths out of 120,000 patients. Now, of those patients, perhaps 40% would be considered high risk, the patients who really needed to be treated to prevent them from going to hospital. So that's 50,000 patients whose lives have been saved by all of this activity. And while I don't do clinical medicine, I went to graduate school after my medical training. I've steered people who ask me what to do. I've steered them to these various clinicians, these telemedicine groups. And I'll tell you, when people write me back saying this saved my life. I was, ready to go to the hospital. I got prescribed these medications. It saved my life. You just can't explain how fulfilling that is, knowing that you've done something right and it's mattered to somebody. And so along with lots of people who say, thank you for sticking up for what you think is right, given all the pressures that there are today in the media, and the media place, so to speak. Aside from that, the people who thanked me for conveying information to them that ended up helping their health or saving their life is just, it's not explainable.
I completely understand where you're coming from with that, and from my side of that same chaos and confusion out there. I've been fielding information and sorting through information and trying to find the good doctors, and it's come to a sad state where we were seeing with our own eyes this discrepancies, and people are suffering and dying of what's happening out there. And when we tried to help our communities, our friends, our neighbors with things that we knew and understood, we all faced basically persecution and attack from the establishment. And this is where none of this was making sense to any of us on a human level. And this is where, so when I first heard about the doctors challenging Premier Ford's team to an open-based debate, this was something that I was really interested in. I reached out to Dr. Burdell, and he was gracious enough to give me an interview. And now this has turned into several, and it's actually turned into a groundswell of people that are looking for the exact same thing. Nobody wants to be angry or judgmental. We just want answers. And 13 months into this, it really is, the longer this goes without addressing people like you that are just simply asking for meaningful discourse and transparency, there is no justifiable reason that we, the public, can see to not give you this opportunity while the world is paying the price for this.
Well, one of the things that seems obvious is that censorship is the tool of individuals who don't have a evidence to use for debating their position. That if people can defend their ideas, there's no reason to censor. So censorship is a tool when the ideas cannot be defended. And that's what we've faced, is no pushback on any ideas. And I'm not talking about fringe people who have crazy ideas for whom an expert would dismiss as just crazy and not spend time on that. I'm talking about respected academics with full academic credentials, career histories of academic excellence, who are raising questions that need to be addressed and have differing viewpoints that need to be discussed. And for the establishment to censor that and not respond to it is not right. And people should complain that these aren't wackos, the people who are talking about this, who are raising these questions. They're experts. They're at least as expert as any of the public health people are in all of the public health jurisdictions and agencies in Canada and the United States, if not more expert. We have individuals, me from Yale, from Harvard, from many universities across the US and University of Toronto, with people that I know as well, who are experts in their fields, who are experts in epidemics, who are experts in virology, experts in vaccines, all of whom have questions to ask that lead to discussion about the various points. None of these points are being discussed. And it's flagrant that it's being censored rather than discussed.
And this is even made that much more obvious. I'm very proud of what I do, but the people that I've been able to speak to over the last couple of weeks, folks like yourself and Dr. Alexander and some of you guys should be on the front wave of every bit of information that the general public is getting. And opposite is what is actually in fact happening. I mean, this is great for me and my platform, but this isn't the way I want to be having these conversations either. Right? I mean, I pay the price for these, and I'm very willing to do this. But this is again more flagrancy in absolutely what is turning into. At this point, I have a hard time even justifying anything less than criminal activity. There's got to be criminal activity in this somewhere, because there is just no other logical explanation without discussion. So,
Well, I agree with you, but I think the interesting thing is that the criminal activity strikes me as not necessarily the government or its agencies. We think of them as the top of the order of our societies, but today that's no longer the case. And there's evidence that some of these multinational corporations have been bullying whole governments of whole countries in South America who've complained about this. And that strikes me as likely to be much more general than the two or three countries in South America that have been explicit in talking about it, that governments have been bullied by this, and it's forced government ministers to comply with that bullying. And that's so they're already part of the trickle down of the whole system. And so the criminal behavior is not necessarily those government people who may feel helpless. We have no idea really what's going on.
well, and this is the more you peel back the onions of all of this, and without getting into global geopolitics, because this is truly a global problem, and most of us in here have done all of the research on that, and we understand where it stems from, and from its unelected foreign entities and lobbyist groups and NGOs and these kinds of things that have been able to set themselves up basically a Ponzi system where they filter money from us in order to have their way with us at the other end of the day.
Right. Follow the money is really it. That's right.
Rule number one of journalism and curiosity, and unfortunately, and it's so blatantly obvious in the problem that is bringing us all together in these kinds of things, and where now we're seeing necessity is the mother of invention, where we're seeing a merger between alternative media, smaller media outlets, grassroots organizations with professionals, and people that are choosing to do what's right, not what's easy, and because it's not an easy path to choose anymore, unfortunately. And this is what I'm hoping and I'm seeing with this. To what's happening here now, the response that we've received to just in the last 2 weeks has been nothing short of phenomenal. Where the amount of engagement our little platform is getting is on par with the biggest outlet in the country. This is a serious indicator of a major problem in our country. I mean, I'm grateful for it, but
right, major popular dissatisfaction. That's right.
Yeah, and so this is what gives me hope that what you guys are doing is getting the right attention, the right support, the right community behind that. But to go back there, I guess what I was implying earlier with one of my questions was, has your debate request had any response from anybody that it was directed to?
Not as far as I know, not from the Ontario government, and not for the other two requests went to, I think, Alberta and Saskatchewan, and they also didn't respond as far as I know.
So this is, again, just, corroborating everything that we're hearing from every corner of the country is exactly the same thing. How long do you think that they can hold out against this groundswell of truth? I mean, you've got to be in such high demand now compared to what you were 6 months ago. 13 months, they can't keep hiding this anymore. The cat is out of the bag.
Well, so I think that this is much more of an economics question. I'm not an expert in this, so I'm just, kind of playing around with ideas here. But I think that the idea was to sell as many vaccine doses as possible. And I think that the messages that we get are all calculated with that in mind. Mm-hmm. And so I'm happy to speak about vaccinating children and
please do.
And vaccine hesitancy and all of those messages, and why they're the push toward those things are both irrational from a scientific point of view, a policy point of view, and how one should think about this in a rational, calm, objective way. One thing I will say is, so we could talk about lockdowns. I think is a very timely and important question. It's part of the genesis of where we're at now. In the United States, each of the states has had its own policies about lockdowns and partial reopenings and reopenings. Some states have had none. Some states have had very short and small ones. And some states have been draconian and have locked down quite a bit, on the order of what Ontario has done. And what you see from that is herd immunity has grown dramatically in the states without the lockdowns, to the point of we had herd immunity last October, November in those states. And by now, most of the states in the United States have herd immunity. So now the question is to define what herd immunity is. Herd immunity, we know in a general sense, is when enough of the population becomes immune that the virus can't get to them anymore. And so there's too few people left to infect. And the virus hops from one person to another to another. And if it can't get through an intermediate person because that person's immune, it protects the next person down the line who might not be immune. So that's kind of the idea behind herd immunity. But herd immunity is also a technical question. And it was defined in 1927 in a paper published in 1927. And in fact, herd immunity is when the epidemic curve is at its top, when it peaks. We know the epidemic curve goes up and then it slows down and peaks, and then it comes back down. Every epidemic does that eventually. Mm-hmm. And herd immunity occurs at the peak of that curve. And so you can look at every state, every country, every province for their epidemic data, look at their curves, see when the curve peaked, and that's when that state, that jurisdiction had herd immunity. Herd immunity doesn't mean that everybody in the jurisdiction has become immune. It means when the whole immunity situation is enough to switch the direction of the epidemic from going up to going down.
There were some states and countries that were showing this model throughout all of this, and it seemed to be forbidden discussion.
Right. It's become the H word, like the other H word besides hydroxychloroquine. So we've already been past herd immunity, but herd immunity at that point is not enough because it's still got a lot of people to infect as the curves come down. So you want the curves to come down fast, not slow. And that means having more immunity than just herd immunity. And that's what happens when the curves come down, because as the infection curves come down, there's lots of people who've been infected, whether you know about it or not, whether they've been symptomatic or asymptomatic. And that's enough to have made a big difference. And what that means is that the immunity in the jurisdiction, in the province, in the state is enough that it suppresses new infections, and so the curves keep coming down. So this has two implications. The first is, if there are mutant strains that start to grow in the population, will those strains be enough to reverse herd immunity so the infection goes back up? The answer to that is, if we were near the peak of the epidemic, and the mutant strains occurred then, yes, it could very well go back up. But on the other hand, now that we're way down, where we've gotten down, 80 or 90% of the way back down the hill, back down the epidemic curve, we're back down. At that point, we have so much immunity that unleashing, for example, the UK variant that increases infection by about 70%, is going to make a bump, and that's it. It'll go up for a bump and then come back down again. So it doesn't look like any of the virus mutants that are out there, even ones that might be more aggressive as an infection, but they're not more infective enough to make that immunity go away. And so this is a very optimistic view of where things will go for the places that have lots of herd immunity. The United States, so the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, estimated the fraction of people who've had COVID asymptomatically. They didn't know they've had it. They were infected and it didn't make any symptoms, to be about 6 times the number of people who got it, who were symptomatic, got tested and had positive tests. And this means that today, approximately half of Americans have actually had COVID. Most, 80 or 85%, didn't know that. But if they're tested, they would find that they have antibodies. Senator Johnson, for example, tested himself and found that he was positive even though he had no symptoms. And that's the common experience or lack of experience for people that they don't know they've had COVID, but they have, and you can test their antibodies and their T cells, and you can find that they've had COVID. So estimating that half the population has had COVID and another 40% now have gotten vaccinated in the US leads to an estimate of about 77% of the population is immune. That's large enough to maintain herd immunity very well. And that's occurred because many of the states did not lock down severely, let young people get affected by the virus in a way that was mostly asymptomatic, harmless for most people, especially young people. And that's what generated the herd immunity in those states. In places, however, that have very severe lockdowns, like Hawaii, Vermont, Ontario, and other places, there's not enough herd immunity for the population to protect itself by that means. What this means is that when those populations open, the populations are like sponges for new infection. They will suck up new infections because they don't have enough immunity in the population to deal with it. And so those are places where vaccination is more important. And the vaccination will help to provide immunity in general. But the other way, of course, of doing that is to let young people mix harmlessly and develop herd immunity naturally. That's what happened in the states in the US that didn't have lockdowns. And those states don't have higher mortality rates than the states with lockdowns. They're entirely comparable. So herd immunity is the key to this, and whether it occurs naturally or by vaccines or both is what ends the pandemic in every jurisdiction. Now, I would point out that if we've got herd immunity in the United States with 77%, we haven't vaccinated kids, we haven't vaccinated young children, we haven't vaccinated adolescents, and yet we still have herd immunity. We have very strong herd immunity. And that means that our epidemic is going away without vaccinating children. Yes, there might be some children with obesity, childhood diabetes, and something where you'd want to protect them because they would be the very rare kinds of people who might do bad if they got infected with the virus. But by and large, almost everybody, children and adolescents, do not need to be vaccinated in order either to prevent the infection from spreading in the public or to protect them from bad outcomes from the virus, because children do not spread the infection. Children get the infection mostly by headaches and tiredness. That is the way they manifest COVID. They don't get coughs, they don't get sneezing, they don't get runny noses, and that's why they don't spread it, because there's nothing coming out of them, by and large, that spreads the infection to adults. The children get the infection from the adults, but they don't give it back. And we've got data from Israel now that shows the infection declining dramatically in children who weren't vaccinated, just like it declined in all the adults who have been vaccinated. So we know that the children are not spreading it, and they don't need to be vaccinated. And that's going to be true in Canada too.
Well, a lot of what I'm hearing here now is exactly on par with everything that we use as common sense when we're thinking about whether it was this pandemic or episode that we're dealing with, or whether it was influenza or a common cold. This seems to be everything is falling in line, whether they want to call it COVID or call it something else. This is the science that we're hearing from the scientists is saying we should be treating it exactly as we always have done in the past. There are always mitigating circumstances with certain individuals, certain cases, comorbidities, micromorbidities, some of these different things that all have an impact on individuals, but as a whole, everything is being done upside down when we should have been doing exactly what we've always been doing throughout these kinds of events especially in Canada. And now this is leading us into an entire host of other issues and problems, collateral damages, rushed treatments, in my opinion. This is just my personal opinion. I'm not an expert or a scientist, but this vaccination program to me is a dangerous and rushed experiment. And I'm not qualified to say specifically anything, but everything that I'm seeing, being a boots on the ground guy, talking to frontline people for the last year and a half, even before the peak of the panic, the doctors and nurses that I was speaking to were saying, yeah, we had something go bad through here really bad last month, but we haven't seen anything like what they've been describing for the last 10 months. So here we are with threats of vaccine passports and a huge amount of propaganda and pressure for vaccination programs that people just don't understand and they're hesitant from. And I mean, without digging into the other side of that, what I'm seeing is it's even getting worse, and it's this own monster creating itself. There's an extreme vaccine hesitancy. I think it's justified. I think this is the problem that they're trying to stop. We still, when I look at the numbers, 3% or something that have had their second vaccine, I don't think it's a vaccine shortage problem. I think it's a hesitancy problem, and I don't think our health officials are being forthright with all of us on that.
Well, look, there are plenty of people in the general population for whom the decision about the vaccine is a rational trade-off
Yeah,
between risks and benefits. Older people, people with comorbidities, and so on, are people for whom it's rational to consider being vaccinated to protect themselves. Everybody's personal decision is to protect themselves. Now, what we also haven't been explicitly told is the vaccine serves two different functions. It serves the function to protect the person who gets vaccinated, to protect them from serious events, hospitalization, or death. But it also serves to protect the public from them, from getting infected from them should they be infected. And we've been told, and all the studies enabling use of the vaccines is that the manufacturers provided clinical trial, randomized trial evidence that the vaccines reduce serious infections by 90%, say, plus or minus. And that's very good, and not perfect, but certainly very good for using a vaccine that was known to be safe. But that doesn't speak to whether the vaccine prevents transmission from an infected person who's been vaccinated to a non-infected person. And that, it turns out, the efficacy is much less. Data from Israel suggests that that's on the order of 50 to 60%. And so what we have is the need for public health agencies looking at the public health benefits of vaccination, seeing that it only cuts infection by 50 to 60%, and therefore saying a much larger fraction of the population needs to be vaccinated in order to cut transmission, at the same time as people seeing, oh, I'll get 90% benefit for protecting me, I'll take the vaccine because it'll be good for me. And I think that's an unfair comparison, and people need to be messaged on an objective and fair and clear message that says what's the motivation for why they're being told to take the vaccines. People have the right to choose to make a decision for themselves, for their own health. The state has an interest, a potential interest, in having people vaccinated to protect unvaccinated people, susceptible people in the country. However, the state's interest only works when the remedy works really well, when there's no other method for protection, when it's narrowly tailored, meaning that it goes right to the point of what needs to be done, and when it's safe. And all of those details about the state's interest in compelling vaccination, either directly or indirectly, are not being addressed. And that's improper as well. And there's no discussion of those points, either in Canada or the United States. So, the rational thing is for people not to feel guilty if they're age 40 and think that they're better served by not taking the vaccination, not to feel guilty that they're not doing their social part because they're going to become immune by getting the infection, quarantining for 2 weeks, not infect anybody else, getting outpatient treatment if they really need it, and developing their own natural immunity and protecting the public that way instead of taking the vaccine, taking the risk for it, and protecting the public in perhaps equal or less beneficial way in that method. So there really is no state compelled interest to do this. in the draconian way that we've been led to believe has to be done in order to protect the whole population. And for the people who have so-called vaccine hesitancy, and I wouldn't use that term, this is a propaganda term, I would say people who've come to a rational conclusion that the risk outweighs the benefit for them and for the society around them. For those people, or for people who have been vaccinated and still get COVID, there is still outpatient treatment, which we have been saying since last May, if not earlier, that there is generic, inexpensive, very safe outpatient treatment to be used that works very well in reducing risk of hospitalization and mortality from this illness. And this outpatient treatment is the economic collapse of the vaccine industry if it were to be widely applied. And so part of the bullying from above to the government and all the government agencies, and this includes NIH, CDC, the FDA in the United States, and so on, all of that bullying was to suppress these generic medications in order to create a tilted playing field to benefit the high-priced agents, the high-priced methods over the inexpensive ones. But that, we know the inexpensive ones work very well. And if anything, now that the US has vaccinated, 40 or more percent of people, those monies have been made, and we still need a backup. There are still vaccinated people who are getting infected and going to hospital. And we need a backup for treating those people. And these medications work to treat those people as well as people who haven't been vaccinated for whatever their rational calculations are.
So this is a compounding of a lack of informed consent about everything is really kind of where people are being cornered with. They're not being informed of alternative treatments and options that are highly effective and showing so, but are still frowned upon, or in some cases not even allowed to be spoken about, as we've seen. In credit to them, the College of Physicians in Ontario did do an about face on their stance on that. They had, I'm not sure if you're aware, they'd come out a couple of weeks ago with a really absolutely mind-boggling statement about restricting doctors to speaking freely about anything that went counter to the guidelines provided to them would be literally punished, would be investigated and punished. And this was a public statement. We did quite a piece on it, and this turned into a fairly substantial story in Canada. Even the Toronto Sun came out with a scathing report about this, saying that it came out of 1939 Germany, not 2021 Canada.
Well, I've been saying we're in the Fourth Reich. What can I say? That's right.
And it's hard to use the proper, accurate terminology in all of this. I really refrain from doing that. In my personal life, I actually use words like genocide and extermination programs, and communism is one of my favorite words these days, because this is in my opinion, again, a COVID crime spree that a select few have been able to infiltrate and create a lot of mayhem over, and it's time to end this. And I honestly applaud you guys for what you're doing. It's not an easy conversation to have, right? To point out the flaws or things that aren't going as they are in a world of academia is a challenge at the best of times, but under the ideological constraints that we're all facing these days, it's got to be extra challenging for you. But this is, to me, the heart of this is a lack of information being provided, and it's, to me, breached criminality. And where do we start pointing our scope of searching and highlighting on the people that are doing this? What you guys have done in challenging the provincial officials to a transparent debate is a great start. But there's people out there that are looking for now. Who else can I contact? Where else should we be looking? Who else is is part of the mechanics of this that needs some accountability?
I wish there were mechanisms of accountability. The problem is when governments are being threatened, and the press is coherent in those messages, that the mainstream media anyway, there's very little in the way of tools to use for pushing back, for holding people accountable, for holding agencies accountable. And, it's a very sorry state of affairs for our democratic countries that all of our mechanisms have become lopsided. And even the medical journals, medical reviewing of papers, has become so ideologically skewed by these economic forces that there's the blatant, fraudulent papers that get published day in, day out in the main usually considered journals of high medical repute, that have lost major degrees of credibility with the thinking medical elite, so to speak. That there's so much bias that even doctors and academics can't figure out how to make sense of the literature without just reading every paper on their own and ignoring reviewers and ignoring which journal it's come from. Today, papers in preprint servers, before they've even been reviewed, count as much as peer-reviewed journals, because the peer review is all biased, because the peer reviewers have conflicts of interest, rampant all across the medical industry. And so it's become a Wild West free-for-all about studies and information and who to believe. And this has set back our academic medical climate 30 or 40 years at least, because we just have no standards now of how to trust any medical information other than reading the paper, knowing the individuals, and using your intellectual, academic, medical common sense. If it's hard enough for us academics to do that, think how hard it is for lay people to figure out what's going on and who to trust.
Well, and this is exactly why I was so excited about being able to do this. I heard it described earlier today that mainstream media were infomercials for dictatorships, and it really struck a chord with me, and I think that's going to be a new favorite of mine as well. And this is exactly where we're at in all of that. So it's a tough challenge, but this is why
Let me just say that Dr. Jason Fung at the University of Toronto made an amazing video in 2017 of corruption in the medical arena, in journals, in publishing, in studies, in randomized trials, and so on. It's almost an hour-long video. It's still up, hasn't been censored, and he cited and showed examples of the editors of the Lancet, of the New England Journal of Medicine, who've complained about undue effects of drug companies in providing them basically compelling but fake, data that gets to be published because they have no choice, because major amounts of their advertising and their salaries are covered by all of these pharma vaccine company supports. And this is also corrupted, and Gates Foundation is part of that as well, has, by financial power, corrupted the objective evaluation of a huge amount of the medical literature today, and especially those journals. And this is why, as I said, it's chaos and understanding what comes out of journals and the mismanagement. This is also why randomized controlled trials today, people cite them, as if they're the gold standard of evidence. Well, they can be, but it also turns out that it's very easy to sabotage a randomized trial in full public view. That it's very easy to create the circumstances of your trial so that it basically finds nothing. So you can take a medication that works very well, like hydroxychloroquine, and design a trial that looks from face, just face view as if it's a valid trial, and then it shows that it had no benefit. And the reason for that is it was constructed by using the wrong patients, the wrong people who weren't at risk of having any benefits, by using medications that the patients could tell apart, that weren't blinded, by using endpoints, what the events that happened to the people, as being so what we call soft endpoints, things that people tell you they felt, rather than objective measures of their antibody levels or things like that. It's very easy to corrupt randomized trials, and making the trials too small so the randomization doesn't even work. It's very easy to do that. The journals don't push back. You see the Journal of the American Medical Association and New England Journal and so on publishing randomized trials of 50 people, where nothing happened, and they said that this shows that this medication doesn't help. But of course, nothing would show, no trial with 50 patients would show that a medication would help. So the whole point of this is it's very easy to make this fake literature out there to push back in a corrupt way against something that actually does work. And this is what's happened, and why there's even a discussion and why there's even a controversy about the usage of these medications, when we know perfectly well from hundreds of thousands of people now being treated, effectively treated, that these medications work dramatically well.
It's just amazing to me, the parallels that I'm hearing here. Yesterday, the guest yesterday is describing the exact same thing in a completely different field of medicine, the exact same process, and hearing you talking about the basically the manufactured destabilization of medicine and academia is exactly the same agenda and program in when I've spent a lot of time talking with Dr. Patrick Moore, the original founder of Greenpeace and the environmental movement. They were hijacked and went through this same process of manufactured destabilization until he realized at one point he was the last scientist in the room, right? And so this is where it's interesting to hear and seeing this possibly ending up where in the future of medicine is the same as environmental sciences, where now he is one of the founders of this ideology, and he is now the biggest proponent against it, because everything noble and just sooner or later becomes corrupt when they've won all of the good fights and money takes over and they become a corporation. There is no good fights left to win, and that's his take on what happened to the environmental movement. But
when objective knowledge becomes an ideology, then there's no science left. And this is a difference between science and scientism, that science basically lets the chips fall where they do. When you do a study, you wait and nature speaks to you. And this is my position all along, is that I'm a scientist. I have no political stake in this. I have no financial stake in this. My job is to look at how nature speaks as to whether this drug or these drugs are effective or not. And so I do the best I can to understand what all the studies, including my own, show. And that's what science is about, is letting the science, letting nature, letting the evidence speak for itself. However, when you use science in order to further political or ideological goals, that is not science. That is cherry picking. That's selecting the scientific evidence you want that furthers your goals and hiding the evidence that is opposed to your goals. And that's scientism. And that's what we've been bombarded with for the last year in the name of science. Follow the science has not been follow the science, it's been follow the scientism.
Yeah, well, it's and what we've unfortunately seen is where the leading scientist on cherry-picked scientist for the government on TV sits there with a stack of papers and gets caught on a hot mic saying, "Oh, I have no idea what it says. I just read what they told me."
Well, the main thing, I teach our graduate students in public health, and the main thing that I tell them when they read a paper is there's three different ways of understanding what's in the paper. The first way is to read the conclusions of the authors. The second way is to read the paper and draw your own conclusions, which may or may not be the same as the author's conclusions. And the third way is to think about what they did, figure out whether what they did is actually reasonable, whether it makes sense to you with your experience from doing the same kind of work, and whether it's even reasonable to think that what they report is the truth as to the way things should have worked. and try to understand its more deeper meanings in that regard and draw conclusions from that. These three different approaches may not be the same by any means. It's difficult to do the third one because you may not have enough information to do it. But sometimes you can, because lots of studies have idiosyncrasies in their results, inconsistencies and things that open up little questions about how do I understand this or that. And this is what thinking science is about, is trying to understand everything in a paper and not just say, oh, they found 5.4 and I'll believe that and go on to the next thing. It's understanding what they really did and how they got to that answer, and drawing your own conclusions.
Well, I really appreciate your take on that and sharing that with us. That really resonates with me, because I think this is what we're seeing again showing itself as flaws in the process here, where for the average person, and even probably a lot of the frontline medical staff, they just don't have the time. They're beat and beat and beat and beat. We're being pummeled from every direction. So I don't want to call people intellectually lazy. We just don't have the time to, or people feel they don't have the time to do that amount of work. So that process kind of gets lost, and people tend to go to the Cole's notes and assume the interpretation of what's being put in front of them, and that's ultimately where we end up in situations like we're in now, when enough people do those kinds of things, I think.
Yeah, but when your patient's life and death is right in front of you, it's your obligation to do that.
Yes.
See fewer patients, go figure it out. You only have to do it once or twice. Read the literature, make sense of it. Don't trust, the what's being spoon-fed to you from an organization that has different motivations than you may have for your patients.
Well, and this is doing all of these discussions is showing the world where the motivation difference is between the doctors that are caring about the lives and what's happening, or versus towing a party line. So I very much appreciate your input on this. It's interesting to have a scientific discussion without making it political, with a political problem in a scientific situation.
My head is spinning.
Well, I hope you enjoyed your time with us here today. We're getting close to the end of the wire here for our time up. And what would you like the people out here listening to hear the most of what you have to share today?
I think that the only recourse we have as societies is to push back with popular outrage. The public has a right to be outraged at being treated as stupid, as being treated as sheep, as not being able to ask valid questions. And I'm not talking about extreme, I'm talking about just regular valid questions that are required, that would be normal questions under any other circumstance. And if that doesn't happen, then the population has a right to be angry, and should use whatever mechanisms it has, whether it's at election time or any other legal mechanisms that it has, to address why its benefit, its health, its safety has not been addressed properly. And those are valid questions that everybody needs to think about for themselves, figure out where they stand, and choose to make their proper legal, behaviors. And if not just by themselves, then form organizations to do that, to generate as much messaging as they can to get answers that they deserve. We all deserve those answers.
That's one of the other things consistently every guest I've had has all agreed upon, and it's time for the people to take responsibility for their opinions and their thoughts and voice them accordingly. And this is not a call for any kind of radicalism or anger, but public outrage should be had. The court of public opinion should be convening on this matter. It should be supporting organizations and groups taking up the tasks that you guys are and the challenges that you are. And thank you so much for your time. You've got a lot of supporters in the room here that will be following along and supporting and paying attention to the work you guys are doing.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
Oh, my pleasure. And again, thank you so much, and we will chat soon. If you want to hang out in the back room for just a second, I will close this out, and we'll finish up with the show. All right, guys, a very challenging discussion for some of you guys today. I could see it in the crowd there a little bit. For anybody that was challenged by this discussion, I would encourage you to go back and listen to this again, because this is exactly the kind of rational, reasonable discussion we need to be listening to in depth. That makes sense. It might, if you're only half listening, it's not going to make sense, but you really need to dig into this stuff, because this is the science. This is the stuff. This is not advocating for one side or the other. This is factual information. We don't, the only way it's real is if we don't love every little bit of it, right? This is what we have to get used to. Not loving every little bit of it, but digesting it and using these kinds of opportunities to make our own educated decisions. All right, guys, I love you all. Stay Canadian. Keep fighting for what you believe in, and we will make Canada Canada again. Bye for now.